Hi everyone, it's Adam with Milo's Restoration, and today I've got a furniture flip for you, and I'm going to show you what I think is the easiest way to get a really high gloss finish. So this was my starting piece here. Basically, I found this old china cabinet that was like a bath set in a thrift store, and the top piece was just not really something that looked very good in my opinion. So we just actually took the bottom and they were able to do something with the top. And I paid $100 for it, and I think it was a pretty good deal overall. So I started by removing the hardware, and I'm also going to clean everything with crud cutter and rinse it really well with water after this. So I've got a microfiber, and you can also see a gray thing that I'm using to scrub the piece with before I wipe it down. That's just like a scuff pad or a Scotch Brite. You can get them from any automotive store, or you can get them from Home Depot. And basically I just use it to make sure that I kind of get all of the grease and contaminants or whatever lifted off the surface, and then I try to wipe everything away with a microfiber. It's just kind of sound logic in my mind. I don't really know if it changes anything or not. So this is really just a scuff sanding. You know, if you already have a factory finish, chances are the finish is going to be very flat, and it's really not going to be needing sanding for flatness, more just scuff sanding for the purposes of adhesion. Because remember, you want a chemical and a mechanical bond. So the mechanical bond comes from this kind of abrading the surface with sandpaper, and then you want kind of the chemical bond, which is basically two components that you are using have some kind of ability to adhere to each other. So in this case we're going to be using vinyl sealer, but you could use a bonding primer of any kind like Sticks or BIN if you wanted to first. But yeah, I just basically give everything a sand with 180 to 220, and then I'll wipe everything off with a microfiber. Okay, so I just started filling some little holes and stuff like that at the top with some Drydex. I sanded that back, and then I moved into mixing up my vinyl sealer. So you can notice that my vinyl sealer, aka my primer, is tinted to the color of my top coat, and that's because I don't use a color top coat, I just use a clear. And basically what I do is I just spray my primer and I reduce it to the point where it lays down very well. So this is where you can kind of start making your life a little bit easier at this point, is that your surface is flat and it's ready to accept your primer, and your primer is reduced properly to where you're not thinking about it like, yeah, this is just my primer, I'm going to sand it later. No, you don't want to think about it like that. You really want your primer to look like glass off of the gun. And the best way to do that is by manipulating the material properly. I can only give you rough numbers to start with. I would say 10 to 20%. And, other variables like your spray equipment, your pressure, and everything else are also going to affect that. So I'm using a 60-gallon air compressor at about 20 psi on the spray gun, and it's a 1.4 tip. And I find that it lays material down very well. So at this point, I'm into my second coat of vinyl sealer, and it's basically reduced the same way, probably about 20% total, half and half, retarder, and lacquer thinner. When I say reducer, I'm using that word interchangeably with lacquer thinner. It's not necessarily true, but it's just, my terminology, I guess. So I don't want to confuse anybody. So at this point, I am doing some sanding after it's had enough time to dry. You don't want to sand it too early because it'll definitely leave scratches and marks and stuff like that. But yeah, I just use a Surf Prep very fine pad or super fine, and I just hand sand everything. It's just easiest, and you don't want to burn through the primer, because if you burn through the primer, your primer is also your color coat. So that is one thing that is a little bit more difficult about just using a clear over a tinted primer, is that you run into the issue of having to be cautious of burning through your primer coat. Okay, so I mixed up my first coat of lacquer here, and my goal with this is that I really just want to spray my coats of lacquer back to back. And to do that, you really need to properly adjust the material. So I'm using a 1.4, same as I was earlier, same pressure and everything else. The only difference is that I'm putting, well, actually I'm putting about the same. I put about 10% uh, retarder, which slows the drying, and about 10% thinner, so it's about 20%. And yeah, I mean, it lays down well, it looks good, and most importantly, I can keep a wet coat, and I don't just have like a bunch of dry spray on the piece, because that's what's ultimately going to determine how your finish looks, is how it's sprayed out. So you might have an 80 sheen or 100 sheen product, but if it's not spraying right, it might look like a 20 or a 30, which you don't want that. The higher the sheen, the higher the gloss, and you want to maximize that full gloss. So this is my second coat. I didn't have to sand in between. If I did, it was just a really quick scuff sanding of areas that needed it. It was not like a full sand. You know, um, it's basically just really quick, and that's what this is about. You want something that's relatively easy and easy to use, and there's a lot of other great ways to get a gloss finish out there, and I just think this is the easiest in my opinion. It might not be the glossiest of glossy finishes, but it certainly does do the trick for me, and I think for most clients it would be good enough. And also, just keep in mind that this area, it's relatively clean. I try to vacuum it every week at least, if not more, but it's not perfectly clean, and that's one of the struggles that I've had with most gloss finishes, is that it's just so difficult. But with lacquer and you know just dumping a little bit of water on the floor and vacuuming sufficiently, you really don't have that problem, because it dries very quick and it doesn't really give dust a chance to get stuck in it. So after that, I started putting the hardware back on. Well, the door hinges anyway. So I shined the hardware up as good as I could. I just mixed a little bit of barkeeper shred with water, and I took a Scotch-Brite and a brush and cleaned them. I was able to get them pretty shiny, but I was not able to get all of that tarnish off. Just on the side, whenever I was putting this piece of furniture back together, I really think this is one of my favorite pieces that I've done. And I could say that about all of them probably, but I just think that I like this color a lot. It definitely has that kind of New York look to it, I guess you could say, especially with the high gloss on it. It definitely kind of accentuates it. And yeah, I mean, I think if you know, it had a paint, if New York had a paint color, I think this is definitely it. And I really like the way that this piece came out, and I think my wife is going to be really happy with it. So thanks for watching, and if you want to see more content like this, please subscribe.